Hey, good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon. Which time
It's
zone?
yeah. Good evening here. Yeah. What time? What is it? Is it daylight over there or nighttime?
Yeah, it's morning.
Okay, great.
It just
Good morning
we
then.
just Thank you. Good afternoon. It's funny to be on such different time zones, but that's one of the things with the SAAG team. We're so across the world. I think we're in like nine different time zones. Is that what we calculated at one point? That's a lot
Oh
of fun
wow.
to yeah. All right, well, hi for everyone who's joining us. We're just getting started. Um, we also have Essen Butt, who is one of the editors at SAAG, and he'll be moderating the questions and comments as we go along. So please feel free to join. All right, so we'll go ahead and kind of get started with introductions. Can you hear me just fine? You're breaking up a little bit, and I'm wondering if it's my Wi-Fi or yours.
You're breaking up a tiny bit, but I'm like getting the gist of what you're saying.
Okay, awesome. All right, so hi everyone. I'm Hananah Zaheer. I'm one of the senior editors here at SAAG, and for all of those who have not yet gone into detail on what SAAG is, it is a literary anthology which seeks to explore and promote dissident traditions in the South Asian literary world, to talk about ideas and art that is radical, political, and experimental. SOG Chats is our attempt to cultivate the kind of literary conversations that we want to have. Curious, opinionated, political, deep diving discussions that are accessible and interest not just the creatives, but the community that we're looking to engage with. This is episode 2, and our guest today is Jamil Jan Kochai. Jamil Jan Kochai is the author of Hemingway and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. He was born in an Afghan refugee camp in Peshawar, Pakistan, but he originally hails from Logar, Afghanistan. His short stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, LA Times, Plowshares, and the O. Henry Prize Stories 2018. Currently, he's a Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. Jamil, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So to get into this, we recently published a story by Jamil, and I believe we get to have him read it to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope I'm coming through okay. If I am, I'm just gonna go ahead and plow right through and start the reading.
Awesome.
So this story is called A Premonition, Recollected. Many years later, Maud will think back to her vision of two gunmen, whom she will not remember. She will see the gunmen in the night, in the snow, huddled at the base of a mulberry tree, at the end of a pathway, waiting for two orbs of light, orbs like spirits, like twins soaring through darkened snow, falling snow. God, and she will see their eyes seeing the headlights of her brother's Corolla, tumbling down upon clay and ice and shadow, and she will see the gunmen step out from under the cover of ancient branches into snowfall, into halos of light obscuring the faces of innocent men, destined to be martyred for crimes they could never imagine, and she will see the tips of their fingers, already bitten by frost, inched toward the warmth of the trigger. They must have been so cold, she will think to herself, having forgotten all else.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
I believe you have something else for us as well.
Yeah, so this is, yeah, absolutely, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think we're a little bit of a delay, but that's the story that SAAG published. And then if you want to read us the other thing that you had selected, and then we can come back to this one.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I'm just going to read from my debut novel, 99 Nights in Logar. I'll just start with the opening page, and then I'm going to skip ahead a chapter, which is actually going back in time, and then we'll go forth from there. On the 32nd morning, Budabash got free sometime in the night. We didn't know how, just that he did and that we needed to go and find him. Me and Gul and Zia and Dawood heading out onto the roads of Logar together for the first time, hoping to get Budabash back home before nightfall. This all happened only a few weeks into my trip. My family's homecoming in the summer of '05, back when it only cost a G to fly across the ocean, from SAAG to SF to Taipei to Karachi to Peshawar, all the way up to Logar, where at the time, though it wasn't dead, the American war was sort of dozing, like in a coma, or as if it were still reeling off a contact high from that recently booming Afghan age, leaving the soldiers and the bandits and the robots almost harmless. So that all that mattered then for a Musafir from America was how he was going to go about killing another hot summer day. So this is the beginning of the second chapter. On the first day, voila, on the morning of my homecoming in the summer of '05, I arrived at Moor's house, car sick, pockmarked, jet-lagged, and barbecued raw by the Pakistani sun after an 8-hour trek through the White Mountains. Kabul's airport belonged to NATO then, so we had to fly into Pakistan and drive up from there, while sweating floods in a black camise and partook, 2 sizes too small, which Moor made me wear just before we crossed the border. And although I was already confused by the earlier events of the morning, my mind fell into a deeper frenzy when we entered Moor's compound for the first time in 6 years. About 50 of Moor's relatives have jammed themselves into the garden of the courtyard, up against the big green gate, and a flood of sparkling dresses and scarves swallowed me as I stepped in. Rahmatullah Mama locked me up in a bear hug as Baba stroked my hair and wetted me with old man smooches before Abu tore me out of my uncle's arms and enveloped me into her chest. She stroked my dirty hair with their calloused hands and kept cursing America for stealing her children. A short while later, I found myself sitting in a big room of clay, not knowing how I got there. I had so much Farsi hurled at me all at once, I didn't know what to do with it. When I told my khalas and mamas and cousins that I couldn't speak Farsi, that I spoke only English and a little Pashto, most of them murmured and tissed and smiled at me sadly. But not to be outdone, they started to speak, as best they could, in a butchered mixture of English, Pashto, Farsi, and sign language. They asked me if I was hungry, if I was sad, if I was tired, if I was thirsty, if I was happy, if I was scared, constipated, lonely, sick, confused, nauseated, stupid, smart, always this dark, always this cute, always this chubby, always this hairy, this tall, this quiet, nervous, shy, lost. I said yes to every single question. So they asked me what I wanted more than anything. I want to see the old dog, I said in English. None of them knew what I was talking about. Sag, I said in Farsi. They blew up with laughter, cursed me and my Moor, and dragged me out to the orchard. Voila, when I first saw Big Budabash standing 3-legged beneath his apple tree, pissing on the bark he was chained to, I still thought he was the same old mutt I met and tortured the first summer I came to Logad in '99. And though I don't remember much of that first trip, my memory of this dog haunted me all throughout grade school, leaving me sleepless most school nights. So when Agha announced in the spring of '05 that he'd scrimped together enough cash for us to visit Logad again, all I could think about was how I was going to get the old dog to forgive me. In the orchard, as soon as I saw Budabash, I broke off from my family and rushed his tree with nothing but sabr in my heart and love leaking out my fingertips, wallah, and it was only after he crouched and lunged and swallowed forever the very tip of my index finger that I saw in his blue moon's eye, in the heart of the eyeball, what no one else was willing to see up until that moment. That Buddha Bosch was not a dog at all, but something more like a mutant or a demon. Voila. So seeing what I did, and with nothing much else to do in the country while my cousins were off at school, for the next few weeks I called a jihad against Buddha Bosch, until, of course, about 31 days later, when he got free.
Well, thank you. For anybody who's joining us now, we're live with Jamil Jan Kochai, who is reading to us, who just read to us from his novel, 99 Nights in Logar, and also the story that we just published for him at SAAG. Well, so let's begin at the beginning, I suppose. One of the questions that Essen has for you, he says, one sometimes assumes a flash piece like this with such momentum is written all in one go. But as a writer, I know that's rarely the case. What aspect of this story came first for you? An image, a bit of language? What was the spark?
Certainly I think it was the image first. Oftentimes I'll start a story with a particular voice or with a particular sentence or something will get me started. But for this one, it was very clearly rooted in this image. I saw this car, rolling down this trail in Logad, and I specifically I saw its headlights like sort of floating through the snow, and then a little ways off, I could see, I could see these gunmen hiding in this tree, and then from there, I was wondering. Then I was just thinking through sort of like who these men are and what brought them to this moment, and that's how it sort of got going.
Okay. And so what about the form, I guess, in which it came out? Because micros are notoriously difficult, and to pack so much, I mean, there's clearly so much of a big story behind just this tiny moment. So how did you decide to do micros? Is this something that you do on a regular basis, or is this like a new experiment?
No, definitely a new experiment. I actually, like quite the contrary, I actually tend to write these very long short stories that, that are sort of like, like almost like borderline novels. Like oftentimes the sort of comment I'll get from other writers is that your short stories feel like novels because I'm just trying to pack so much into them. And so with this, this section as well, initially I thought maybe it was a part of a larger piece. I thought maybe it might even be the ending of a story. I've never written the ending of a story first before, but it was something I considered. But the more I thought about it, and the more I was sort of able to, the more details I was sort of able to fit into this one sentence, and I got to a point where I felt comfortable with what I was able to accomplish in terms of characterization, in terms of the relationships between these different the different characters sort of existing in the story, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna leave it as is and see how it's read and how it's taken.
Well, one of the most interesting things I think about this for me, even though it's a story about these two men, sort of, but it's really a story about this woman who's watching this thing happen. But there's not much of her here except her observation. So can you talk a little bit about that choice? Because I find that interesting. We're learning about her through what she's observing and not what her life is really like, other than just the one piece of information we get.
Yeah, so this is the character who's the sort of the protagonist of the story. It is a character who she appears in my other stories before, and so I'm working on a story collection right now, and so part of it was that I guess I'd already known a lot about this character from this other story, and then, I think I wanted her in this one moment. I think I wanted this moment to be more about her observing this moment, about her relationship to this moment, than really like any like strict um, any strict act of characterization. It's definitely something I went back and forth on a lot. Like, it felt like I needed more characterization here for the sort of the central character, but it was something that, I don't know, it felt like the story almost felt like it was resisting that intention. It felt like any attempt that to implement that, especially in that very first section, that's where I wanted a couple of details of characterization to go in. But I don't know, it just felt wrong for some reason. It felt artificial. It felt like I was forcing the story to go to a place it didn't want to go. And I think maybe that's because I had other story that had already done the work of characterization. And so I just thought, for this one, I'm just gonna let her sort of be almost like a voyeur.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing, because I feel like she basically bookends this story. And then the rest of it is her assumptions about who these people are, which I think does the work, in fact, of characterizing her, like her assumptions of who these boys must have been and how their moms must have gotten pregnant. And here she is now looking at them. And I like love the last line, they must have been so cold, she will think to herself. I just feel like there's so much, it actually gives me chills to kind of read that. Um, well, let's see. We've got another question. Can you talk a bit about the title? It mentions a premonition that Moore has likely erased from her memory. Did she know her brothers were about to be shot? Also, what about the semicolon? The semicolons make me think of fragments or a sudden turn, both of which are fitting for this story. So maybe we can talk about the title first and then the semicolon, because punctuation's its own topic, I guess.
Yeah. Well, with this story, from the very first line, I sort of knew that I wanted to play with time quite a bit in this story. And so, starting off, I could sort of see that this moment it was going to be sort of like a vision. It was going to be a vision of the future, but then I wanted it to be, a vision of the future that she will have forgotten and then remembered in the past. It's sort of, I don't know. I was thinking, I was reading through. Um, 100 Years of Solitude a good bit when I was rereading it while I was writing the story, and I think I was thinking a lot about how Marquez is often playing around with time and with premonition and with memory and with ghosts and haunting in that story. And so, yeah, I think I wanted it to sort of explore this idea of visions, or of the future being remembered, and just sort of play around with time in that way. Um, in regards to the semicolon, a lot of the time, the way that I think about punctuation, during college, I didn't grow up speaking English, right? So I learned English, how to read and write in English when I was about 8 years old, and since then, I've actually had a tremendous amount of trouble figuring out, like, the grammatical, like, sort of memorizing the grammatical rules of English. And it wasn't until college that I, like, specifically took this class on grammar I didn't need to take, and I read this entire textbook about grammar, that I learned the rules, and just because I felt like I needed that and in my background. But even then, I still find myself, even now, like, more so than paying attention to the rules of punctuation, I'm more concerned with what a punctuation mark can do in terms of, like, breath and rhythm. And so for this story, a comma didn't feel right for me in the title, because it felt like it was going to read a little bit too quickly. A premonition, recollected, and so for that reason, I sort of landed upon, and then I also sort of played around with the idea of an ellipses, premonition, but then ellipses felt like it was taking up too much time, and it just sort of looked ugly as well. And so for me, the semicolon sort of was like the perfect sort of balance, where I wanted that breath to sort of linger there between that first phrase, a premonition, and then after that, the recollection, and how that changes the sort of the idea of what a premonition can do, and how it can exist in a story.
I see that. Actually, it's interesting now that I'm actually looking at this on the screen, and it's almost like it echoes what's happening in the story, which is like the fragmented, two fragmented but attached related elements of the same thing. So it is, so that's interesting. Now, On a slight side note, I know a lot of writers that I speak to have favorite punctuation marks. What's yours?
That's a great question. I do a lot of work with the comma, but I think I actually take the comma for granted. So I wouldn't say like the comma is my favorite punctuation. Actually, I think it has to be the dash line. I think I use the dash line more than most, like many writers do. I think I use it way too often. But there's something like I often find myself sort of interrupting myself in my sentences, and there's just something about the dash line and that it just comes right there, and then I can just go off on totally this other thought that's sort of related to the sentence before, or like the sentence within which it's located. But I love that this idea that with that dash line, it sort of gives me the freedom to go in a completely different direction, or like a different note, or a different detail of characterization, or whatever it is in the middle of a sentence that's already doing its own work. So I think it would have to be the
I
M dash.
cannot agree with you more. The
Oh,
M
that's
dash
great.
has to be for the exact same reasons. But I've thought about this, and I kind of feel like maybe it's because it adds an element of performance to the telling of the story, because you can kind
Definitely.
of break the action, turn to the camera, and go, and this, and then resume whatever you were talking about. So I feel like it allows for a little bit more movement and interaction with the reader in some way. Almost
Hmm.
like here, let me give you a little bit of extra information before I take you back into the story.
That's great. Yeah, it's like sort of a dramatic punctuation mark. It's not. I feel like it's not afraid of itself. It's just right there in front of you. Whereas, I don't know, with commas, sometimes it feels like commas sort of hiding themselves a little bit.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's great.
So this character, you said you've been working with her in other stories as well. Is the collection also going to be based in Logar?
Yeah, with the collection, like Logata, it's a location that I really can't get away from. Like even if I wanted to sort of like focus on a different location, or on different locale, or on different characters, Logata is always sort of just calling to me, and it's really, for many years now, maybe even like the past like 2 decades or something. It's really been sort of the heart of my sort of fictional imagination, I think. But that being said, I've also found myself being able to write like my hometown of West Sacramento much more than I've ever been able to in my life. I think I lived in Iowa for 2 years. Just a few years ago, 2017 to 2019, and it was my first time actually living outside, like a great distance away from West Sacramento, and I think that sort of allowed me, and I found myself, I don't know, out of a sense of nostalgia, or like longing for home, or something weird like that. I found myself just all of a sudden writing these stories about West Sacramento, and so yeah, so Logad, I would still say, many of the stories are centered on Logad, and in many ways, still sort of the heart um, of like my literary imagination. But there's stories in here set in West Sacramento. There's stories in here set in Davis. There's stories in here set in Kabul. So I'm trying to like very slowly branching out Iowa City, branching out with the locales I inhabit in my story.
Do you think that's partly because you got, for lack of a better term, writing the initial thing about Logar out of your system, and now you sort of have permission to explore other places?
I think definitely has something like that's definitely a big part of it, because I just remember, for so many years when I got back from Logad in the in the fall of 2005, and I was 12 years old. And, since then, like for just years and years, I was just absolutely haunted by these memories I had of the time I spent there. And they're just so dear to my heart, and it was just such a precious time for me. And, when I began writing in college, it was all I could think about. And so, those memories ended up turning into the novel 99 Nights in Logad. And I think it was when I finally finished that novel, I was able to sort of put it down and sort of step away from it. I do think that sort of did give me like permission now to think about these other locations and to think about these other times.
That's interesting. Well, so this another thing is this relationship. Do you see a relationship between the novel and the short stories that you're writing? Is there any sort of sense of continuation or reflection, or is this leading out from the novel world at all?
Yeah, certainly. You know, I've got a few stories in the collection. I think maybe two or three, where it's actually just it's characters from 99 Nights in Logod, sort of in the future. I have one story that's actually set in Logod in 2005, sort of the same time and location as the novel, but it's just sort of it's sort of written in the format of a play, and it's just this sort of episode, this adventure that I didn't get a chance to explore in the novel. And so yes, you know, I think those characters in 99 Nights, there's you know, many of them are very much they're autobiographical characters, and I think they're characters that they won't be sort of leaving my repertoire of characters to focus stories on for a very long time.
Well, one of the questions that we have is Aspen is interested in knowing about your inspirations or writers that have been essential to your sort of growth as a writer yourself.
Yeah, you know, I would say number one would have to be Marquez. You know, when I first read 100 Years of Solitude, that was really the first time I think, you know, I'd loved reading for a long time, and I'd read these different books, and I'd been moved by these different books. I think I read 1984 when I was 14 years old, and that was a book that like really terrified me. And then I read The Native Son when I was 15 years old, and that was another book that just absolutely destroyed me. Such a tragic novel. But it wasn't until I read 100 Years of Solitude as I was entering college, I believe, or maybe the final year of my high school, where I was just completely in awe of the magic of what a novel could accomplish. And, you know, not just in terms of like the magical realism that actually appears in the novel itself, but just in terms of like what Marquez was able to accomplish in that novel, with how he was moving through time, with the amount of characters he was able to explore, with the ways he was able to sort of mix together these elements of Colombian history with you know, these other like sort of more you know, magical folkloric elements with the characters themselves, you know, the personal lives of these characters that was very much tied to. And I remember reading it and just being completely awestruck and feeling deeply intimidated by the novel, but at the same time, like also very, very inspired. I think at that point Marquez sort of became maybe like this very, very distant goalpost for me, as like, you know, if I can do something that even remotely resembles 100 Years of Solitude for Logod, or for, you know, even for West Sacramento, like that's going to be the goal. I think that's the faraway dream.
Do you often, you said you read Marquez again while you were working on the story. Do you often read writers to kind of inspire you into writing, or similar to what you were working on at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. That's you know, and especially with stories that I think that are drawing upon elements that I know that Marquez does well. You know, one of the things that I'm doing, you know, I'm reading I'm writing a story right now about a PhD student who crosses his mother's namaz and turns into a monkey, and then it's a whole adventure. And for that story, it's this story that I've been working on for years and years now. I can't get a handle on the story, but for this story and for the voice I wanted the story to sort of exude, I've been reading Marquez like every single morning. And so actually, I'll just pull it up here. So this is my copy of Marquez. It's like I've like tore through this novel And so,
That's a
yeah,
well-read book.
yeah. So, I've read this book like at least like 10 or 12 times, something like that. I've lost count. And it's something that like every single morning now, before I begin writing, I'll take like a sip of my coffee first, and then I'll just open up a random page of 100 years, and then I'll just start reading through the sentences. And I think it's really at the sentence level. Like that's the first thing I fell in love with Marquez, is how beautiful his sentences were, or the translation, I would say. And I'll just start reading the sentences, and I'll look at the structure of the sentences, and then that'll sort of get me going for my own sentences. It sort of gives me like a kickstart to get writing on my own.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Yeah, because I see the advice being dispensed around as well, that if you want to write something, you have to sort of put that language in your ear and your brain for that to translate into good sentences. And I certainly, for me, I feel like anytime I'm feeling like I can't produce something, writing certainly at least helps me panic enough that then I get to the page and kind of go like, well, let me try something. Um,
Absolutely. It's funny because like in the past, I would always get into these situations where I would get stuck writing, and then I would just like